Australia, through the pandemic and the crisis, was one of just only 9 countries in the world to retain our AAA credit rating. Our response was timely, it was targeted, and it was temporary. We responsibly retired measures as soon as it was prudent. This led to an historic reduction in the budget deficit in our final year of more than $100 billion. During this time, I and the government made many decisions, from closing our international borders to making our own vaccines and directly manufacturing PPE. We tried many things. We were dealing with extreme uncertainty and unpredictability. The Australian people were rightly fearful for their own health and economic security. The mindset at this time was to seek to prepare as best as possible for as many contingencies as possible. This was not always successful, as was the experience of all countries around the world at the time. No leader and no nation had a perfect record, but Australia can be proud that we had one of the very best. At the same time, significant powers were activated by the government, including under the Biosecurity Act and in financial delegations to the Minister for Finance that were beyond the oversight of Cabinet. I elected to put in place a redundancy to those powers and an oversight on these powers in the Departments of Health and Finance. I do not resile from these decisions and believe them entirely necessary, mirroring many arrangements similarly being implemented in the private sector at the time. My omission was not having personally informed the Minister for Finance, who I believed had been informed through my office. Mr Speaker, I was mistaken about that, which was only brought to my attention when I made these matters public. I've addressed this issue directly with the then Minister for Finance. Had I been asked about these matters at the time at the numerous press conferences I held, I would have responded truthfully about the arrangements I had put in place.
Order.
The recommendations of the Bell inquiry will appropriately remedy this deficiency in the future, and I support them. The decision to take on authority to administer the Departments of Treasury and Home Affairs in 2021 as a dormant redundancy for decisions that were not subject to Cabinet oversight was to be able to take swift action, if necessary, in the national interests in a time when Australians' interests were under constant threat. I now consider that these decisions in hindsight were unnecessary. They were unnecessary, and that insufficient consideration was given to these decisions at the time, including non-disclosure. I therefore accept the recommendations put forward by the Bell inquiry as an appropriate remedy to these shortcomings. I note again that these authorities were never exercised and as a result had no impact on the functions or actions of the government. It is strange to describe such actions as a power grab, as they were never exercised or even used to exercise influence over the relevant ministers. They were simply a dormant redundancy. In relation to the decision to take authority to administer the Department of Industry, Science, Resources and Technology for the purposes of being able to consider PEP-11, I do not resile from that action. The authority was lawfully sought and exercised on a specific matter solely. I considered it unnecessary to dismiss the minister to deal with this matter, as he's doing a fine job, and unlawful to inappropriately pressure him in relation to this decision. I therefore lawfully took the decision from first principles in his place. I believe the decision I made on PEP-11 was the correct one. Mr Speaker, I note the criticisms made of my decisions to be authorised to administer a series of departments have been made from the safety and relative calm of hindsight. I also note that as Prime Minister, my awareness of issues regarding national security at this time and the national interests was broader than known to individual ministers and any third party could. This limits the ability for third parties to draw definitive conclusions on such matters and sit in judgment. During the course of my Prime Ministership, I made many decisions. These decisions were taken during an extremely challenging period where there was a need for considerable urgency and there was great stress on the system and individuals. None of us can claim to be infallible in such circumstances, and I do not. And there are always lessons to be learned from such times and events. Mr Speaker, I acknowledge that the non-disclosure of arrangements has caused unintentional offence and extend an apology to those who were offended. But, Mr Speaker, I do not apologise for taking action, especially prudent redundancy action in a national crisis in order to save lives and to save livelihoods. I also agree with and thank the many, Mr Speaker, who have expressed their support that any perceived deficiencies in the handling of these matters must be reasonably and fairly weighed against the overarching success of the numerous other decisions taken and efforts made under extreme pressure to save lives and livelihoods. Mr Speaker, this motion fails to do this and sadly, therefore, betrays its true motive, that is entirely partisan. The government's response to censure and prosecute this motion is to engage in the politics of retribution and nothing less. Sure. These are the behaviours of an opposition, Mr Speaker, not a government, who understands that grace in victory is a virtue. As a government, Mr Speaker, I recommend that their response should simply be to implement the recommendations of the Bell inquiry, which I support, and focus their attention on their current and urgent responsibilities to address the many challenges Australians are now facing on their watch, especially the cost of living. How we respond to these events, Mr Speaker, is up to each and every one of us. For mine, I will take the instruction of my faith and turn the other cheek. Since the election, I have refrained from public comment, despite provocation, other than on local issues, and to note the actions and achievements of my government. I accepted the result, as I should, willingly and happily, of the last election and wished the new government every success and have sought to move on with my life, with my family, and to continue to serve the people of my local electorate in Cook. I voluntarily stepped down from the leadership of my party and gave my full support to the new leadership, whom I commend, and I thank them for their support, especially the Leader of the Opposition and the Deputy Leader of the Opposition. And I thank all of my colleagues for the same, both former and current, both now and over a long period of time. And in that I particularly acknowledge the former Treasurer Josh Frydenberg, the former Minister for Health and Aged Care Greg Hunt, and the member for Riverina, who together, the four of us, dealt with so much of that crisis each and every day together. Mr Speaker, I have seen bitterness destroy people who have come to this place, and it continues to gnaw away at them each and every day of their lives for even decades after they leave this place. I am not one of those, nor will I ever be. I am proud of the many achievements that I've been able to accomplish in this place, especially as Prime Minister. And I am very grateful for the opportunities and to all of those I work with to achieve them. We saw Australia through one of our most difficult times. We stood up to a bullying Chinese regime who sought to coerce and impose itself on our democracy through threats, sanctions and intimidation. I was pleased to establish the AUKUS agreement and tightened our partnerships with all our key partners, especially the United States, Japan, India, the United Kingdom, and across our region in ASEAN, where we were the first country to establish a comprehensive strategic partnership with ASEAN. And, of course, our dear Pacific family. I was pleased to have strengthened our economy through the pandemic and see electricity prices fall by 10% on my watch as PM, for individual and small businesses' taxes to be cut, and more than 300,000 Australians directly assisted into home ownership. And by strengthening our economy, I was pleased we were able to guarantee the essential services that Australians relied on during times of great uncertainty, with record Medicare bulk billing rates, PBS listings at record levels, and record funds for aged care, disability care and mental health. For those who now wish to add their judgment today on my actions in supporting this censure motion, I simply suggest that they stop and consider the following. Have you ever had to deal with a crisis where the outlook was completely unknown? In such circumstances, were you able to get all the decisions perfectly right? And where you may have made errors, were you fortunate enough for them to have had no material impact on the result, and the result itself proved to be world-leading? Once you have considered your own experience, or perhaps when you have had more in government, then you may wish to cast the first stone in this place. Perhaps the response to these difficult times and events is not to go down that path, Mr Speaker, but down the path of thankfulness that Australia's performance through the pandemic was one of the strongest in the developed world, to appreciate in humility, not in retribution, that no country and no leader got all the decisions right, and gracefully, Mr Speaker, take up the lessons that have been learned and equip us to even do better in the future. It is an honour to serve in this House, and I've done that for these past 15 years. And I'm grateful again to the people of Cook for their strong support during this time, including most recently. I thank them for their encouragement, their many messages of support as I and my family have returned to our dear home in the Shire. I also thank my local Liberal Party members for their constant support, and my local church community at Horizon Church for their prayers, and people of faith from all around the country have extended the same. I've been humbled by your message of support and encouragement. I also thank again my colleagues here in this place and formally for their support. It has been an honour to serve alongside you. I especially thank my wife Jen and our daughters Abby and Lily, my family and friends for their love and support, as well as my former staff for their great loyalty. You must always be proud of what you accomplished during our time working together. I conclude, Mr Speaker, by thanking the Australian people for the privilege of being able to serve my country in so many roles, but especially, Mr Speaker, as Prime Minister. Mr Speaker, I gave it everything I had. I did it to the best of my ability and in the best of faith. Each and every day I had the privilege to serve the Australian people.